David, I concur. It was beautiful this morning. It's always good to sing praises unto God, but to hear them so well done, many voices together, and the higher we can lift, I think the higher our hearts are lifted as well. It's wonderful to be here this morning. Thank you so much for being with us, especially if you're visiting with us. We want you to know how much you are welcome and wanted here at West Hill. We want you to be part of God's kingdom here that meets in Corsicana. There was a miser who scrimped and saved and saved and scrimped all of his life. By the end of his life, as he was nearing death, he knew that he had a great sum of wealth. And at his deathbed, he asked his wife, he said, "Honey, would you please promise me that you'll put all my money in my casket with me when I die?" And she said, but honey, I'm going to need something to live on. Well, I understand that, but you'll have my retirement that'll keep coming in. So if just everything that we have right now, bottom line, just put it in the casket with me. And a little upset, the wife agreed, okay, I'll put all the money in your casket. And she didn't really want to do that, but she knew that, she loved her husband and she wanted to do whatever it was that he had asked. And so the day came that he finally passed on, and they had him there in the casket, and before everyone at the funeral, and just before they closed the casket, she got up and she had a shoebox. And she walked over and she placed it in the casket with him, and they shut the lid and they locked it down as they do. And she came over and she sat beside her friend, and she said, her friend asked her, she said, did you really put all of his money in the casket with him? And she said, yeah, I sure did. She said, you were really crazy enough to put everything that he made in his casket? She said, yeah, well, first I moved it all to my bank account, and then I wrote him a check. There's a lot of people in this life that like to hold on to their riches. They've worked and they've saved and they've done everything possible to make sure that they have enough money. And it seems that in this particular time of year that materialism and consumerism tends to pick away at us more than at other times. Joy to the world, the Lord has come. But some say, joy to the world, my check has arrived. And that's how they live. That's what they want. But what if all the things that we loved in this life, all of our material blessings were taken away? Our home burned and we lost our job. Our family forsook us, and all we had were what little clothes we had on our back and a corner on a sidewalk outside of a diner asking for someone to give us the change that they would have normally left to a waitress. Could you still say, joy to the world? Would your joy remain intact? Habakkuk, one of the Old Testament prophets. Not a book we go to often, especially not during this time of the year to talk about prosperity, but really it is a wonderful time because when we look at Habakkuk, what is happening in his life is God is telling Habakkuk, the nation has turned its back on me. And Habakkuk says, yeah, I understand. Well, they're doing really badly. Yes, I understand. Morally, they are corrupt. Habakkuk, yeah, I understand. God says, so I'm going to punish them. And Habakkuk said, yeah, they probably need it. God said, I'm going to punish them by sending them into captivity to Babylonian. And Habakkuk, yeah, wait, what? Babylonians? The Babylonians, God. I know that the Israelites are bad, but the Babylonians, they're much worse than we are. And God says, yes, they are, but I will eventually come upon them as well. So there's this discussion that goes throughout the entire first two chapters, only 3 chapters in the book, goes through all of this, and by chapter 3, Habakkuk has come to the realization that God is going to come in a judgment scene. He's going to come in fierce wrath. He uses language like God is going to use the arrows of the warrior, and he's going to the own arrow, the one that the warrior actually owns, and God's going to use them to pierce his head through. God is going to trample upon the waters, and his steeds will race over the oceans. And in chapter 3 and verse 16, Habakkuk says, and when I hear these things, I tremble. It scares me to death to think about what God is going to do. In fact, my legs tremble and become weak underneath me. Yet he says, I will wait quietly for the day of trouble to come upon the people who invade us. You see, God is writing or telling this to Habakkuk before the Babylonian captivity even begins. And so what little hope Habakkuk has, is tied to the fact that ultimately, in the end, God is going to bring salvation. But before he can get to that salvation of the nation, he's got to go through 70 years of captivity. And then he's got to go through God's judgment upon the Babylonians. And he writes these words beginning in verse 17. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. You see what Habakkuk is saying? He is talking about financial calamity. The fall of everything that the nation itself would consider prosperous. He begins with this vision of crop failure. The fig tree has no blossom, the blossom which would eventually become fruit. There's no fruit upon the vines, the grapes are not made. There's no produce on the olive trees, they are barren. The fields which would normally bring forth the grain for which the harvest would be, he says that they yield nothing. There's nothing in them. They couldn't look at such a barren field and such empty orchards and say, oh well, we'll go down to H-E-B and buy a few more groceries. There was no H-E-B. There were no grocery stores. The marketplace was directly dependent in those days upon what was harvested right then, because there were few ways to store such food. So there's crop failure, which is bringing famine, destitution, and hunger to the land. The flock shall not come to the fold. That is, there are no sheep in the field to come back to the corral, the fold. There's no herd that would normally be in the land and would come and be put up at night in the stalls of the barn. There's nothing there. Not only is there no plant food, there is no animal food. There is complete desolation and ruin of the people. And something we learn very quickly in this life that we're reminded of throughout the Bible is that riches are fleeting. Riches are fleeting. They don't last forever. Grain will sometimes not produce. Farmers have gone not just 1 or 2 seasons, but 5 or 6 seasons where the yield of their land has been half of what it normally would. In times of drought and seasons of distress, they look to other places to find wealth because there's no wealth in the normal avenues. But here the prosperity is completely cut off. And even there, even in modern times, such poor crop yield nearly destroys, if not destroys, families. Farms are foreclosed upon. Barns are lost because there was no wealth. There's nothing to sustain it. Because wealth is fleeting. Jesus would say in Matthew chapter 6, beginning in verse 19, to lay not up for yourselves treasures upon this earth, where the moth and the rust corrupt. You see, what is here on this earth is temporary. It can be corrupted. The moth or rust can corrupt it. Thieves can break through and steal it, he says. Those things which are material and temporary on this earth are just that, material and temporary. They are not intended or designed by God to last forever. They are fleeting. And when we attach our joy or hang our happiness on the material things of this life, it too is fleeting. How often have we heard those, as Rusty mentioned the other night in his devotional, said, if I just had one more of this, if I could just afford, and we begin to attach our happiness to the things of this life. And the simple fact is that is catastrophe. Solomon would write in Ecclesiastes 5 and verse 10 that those who want more money will never have enough. There will never be that point at which you say, aha, I have arrived. If it's just one more of these or a little more of that, when you get it, it's, well, if I just had just a little bit more, and you get that, and you want just a little more, and a little more, and a little more, and it is a never-ending cycle because our happiness is attached to the material. Paul tells us, 1 Timothy 6 and verse 10, that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, which many who craving, who desire, who long for that, have led themselves astray and been pierced through with many sorrows, because wealth is fleeting. Habakkuk recognizes that. I see that the crop and the animal may be taken away. And when that happens, notice what he says in verse 18. Yet, in the midst of destitution, in the midst of poverty, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. He sees first that failure of prosperity, but now he sees the reason for his joy. It was not that the crop was yielding. You know, sometimes we look back at the old nation of Israel as they're faced with the prospect of going into the land of milk and honey, the land flowing with milk and honey. And those that looked upon that and said, well, this is going to be great because there's going to be a lot of milk and a lot of honey there, they were going to be utterly disappointed. But you know, those who went into the land saying, this is going to be great because God is going to be there, they found joy and happiness. When we attach our joy to things otherworldly, to heaven, to God, to His Son, then when the temporary is taken away, whether we're talking about the end of the world, when everything is burned up with all of the elements thereof, or when we're talking about misfortune that may be cast upon us, and all the things that we've worked for have been taken away, or if through poor decision and poor planning we find ourselves in destitution, whatever it may be, we can still find joy if our joy is attached to God. Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon this earth, but he says later, lay up for yourselves treasures which are in heaven, where rust and moth cannot corrupt, where thieves cannot break through and steal. For where your treasure is, there's where your heart is going to be as well. There's where your happiness is going to be. There is where your joy is tied. If we anchor it in heaven, then it can endure all these bad things. And that's what he's saying. He says, my joy, I rejoice in God. This is the reason for my happiness. The greatest insurance is not flood insurance or auto insurance or home insurance. The greatest insurance is knowing that God holds my destiny. Is knowing that God has given me a promise. Is knowing God's protection in my life. You see, he was looking down the road past the time of the captivity, really past the time of the restoration. I think Habakkuk's looking down the road to us in the church. This is the real salvation. And he says, I take joy in salvation. Brethren, we need to start taking joy in our salvation. I know we love our families. We love to see them. Love to be around grandkids and children and things, and don't want to take those things away. But even those things are fleeting. The only thing that is eternal is God in heaven. And let that be our joy, the joy of our salvation. Then he finishes with this picture of greatness. When he says the source of his great victory. Notice verse 19. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. A triple or a triplet that we would say, in which he he escalates each time. God, the Lord, is my strength. We understand that God and His power and His might and His desire undergirds all that we do. He gives us power. Paul would say in Philippians 4 and verse 13, I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. Talking about Christ. Christ strengthens me. He gives me spiritual fortitude to endure whatever life may throw at me. As long as my treasures are laid up in heaven and my joy is not attached to those things which are fleeting and momentary. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's feet. Some translation, the hind, some the gazelle. The idea is that it's the animal that is of fleet foot, that runs and bounds and leaps far above everything else, that runs up the hill higher and higher and higher, that he is able to escape the draw and the downfall of this world, to escape the hunter and the snare, to escape those that are seeking to make him a prey, to bound further and further away and yet closer and closer to God. Swift and sure. But then that last one. As if escaping the enemy was not enough, God says to us in 1 Corinthians 1 or 10 and verse 13 that God is going to make a way of escape for us. He's going to make our feet like the deer's, is the idea, to escape the enemy. But then he says, and He makes me to tread upon my high places. Now, usually in the Old Testament, the high place was a reference to the altar of false worship. But sometimes it was simply a reference to the heights. And if you've ever climbed a mountain, if you've ever stood on the top of a high hill, and looked out over the valleys around you, and been struck by the beauty and the splendor of the view, breathtaking in those moments, to talk about how great it is to stand in God's creation. Habakkuk says, God lifts me up to stand on the highest pinnacle of earth. And I look out and I see all the things that are around me, and I know that here I am with God. Isaiah would say in Isaiah 40 verse 31, they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. What did Habakkuk say? I will wait quietly on the Lord in the day of trouble. They shall mount up with wings like eagles, which soar to never-ending heights into the presence and the bosom of God. That's our high place. And he says, God puts me there. And so as the world seeks for joy and tries to attain it maybe through wealth, or through friends and relationships, or through any way that is momentary and earthly, we know that that joy is fleeting. It's an illusion. Our joy is to be in God. Take joy in His salvation. If this morning maybe salvation has eluded you, that concept of trusting and finding joy in God is foreign to you, and you say, you know, everything that I've found happiness in, it dies, it passes away, it's stolen, it's lost. Let me encourage you to find something that can't be stolen. Find something that will always be where you left it, in the hands of God. Take joy in His salvation, in the salvation that has come through Jesus Christ. If this morning you're outside of Christ and you're seeking that salvation, you want to be on the high places, the heights of joy, it begins right here this morning by responding to His gospel invitation. Being baptized for the remission of your sins, God will add you to His church. Here you will find joy, joy like no other. If you're ready for that, won't you come while we stand and while we sing?